Good afternoon. I'm Richard Parker. I, for 30 years, taught here at the Kennedy School and was senior fellow in the Shorenstein Center. And I'm delighted to be back here today with my Shorenstein colleagues, talking about a former Shorenstein fellow, Neal Gabler, to my left, who is just now publishing the second volume of a masterful and massive biography of the late Massachusetts Senator, Edward M. Kennedy. We're here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and it seems only appropriate to have Neal with us today to talk particularly, I think, about this second volume, which traces Kennedy's career from the mid-1970s up until his death during the very first year of the Obama administration. Then for those who have lived with the past 40 years as a time of conservatism and setback for many liberal values that Kennedy tried to embody in many ways and did embody, there is a sense that something may be changing. Something may be happening in the election that we've just held that augurs a new kind of era. And I want Neal to talk about not just why he chose to take on Ted Kennedy as a biographical subject, but what he thinks the relevance of Kennedy's career is today. Kennedy's been dead for 9 years. And what we need to ask
13.
Oh, I'm sorry, 13. That's right, 2009. We need to ask ourselves what it is that we can draw from the past, both about the Kennedy family and Ted Kennedy in particular, and the way that they affected American liberalism for so long, and the course that American liberalism, if you will, is trying to follow today. So, Neal, thank you so much for joining us here today. We're delighted to have you with us.
You know, let me begin by a conversation that we had in preparation for this, because I think it was interesting. You said that you cut your political teeth on John Kennedy's campaign.
Yeah.
And I countered that I cut my political teeth on Robert Kennedy's campaign. And in fact, as you and I discussed briefly, I was in the room when he was shot. Now, why is that interesting? Other than the two old fogies are talking about how the Kennedys many years ago affected us. It was because when we compared notes and we asked, why did they affect us? What did they have? What was it about the Kennedys? I mean, there was a consensus almost immediately that both John and Robert Kennedy, and we'll talk about, Edward today, created narratives. Now, when we talk about narratives in modern politics, the narratives are generally skimpy. They're like beach reads, really. I mean, the Trump narrative or even the Biden narrative. They're small narratives. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about the Kennedy narratives are large and they're sweeping. Because what John and Robert brought into American politics was a sense of larger purpose and destiny, and even a word that you're going to hear a lot this afternoon. I use it all the time. It's a word that's poison in the general press. I can tell you this parenthetically because I've tried to generate essays. Now, I've written hundreds of essays for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Atlantic, you name it, I've written for all of them. I can never get this essay published. It's published about morality. No one will touch anything about morality. That's poison. The third rail of politics is Medicare. The third rail in journalism is morality. So this moral vision that John Kennedy generated, whether you regard him as moral or not, and that Robert Kennedy generated, and very purposefully, in part because of his brother's death, to save the moral soul of the nation. I mean, that's what Robert Kennedy said when he ran for the presidency. It echoes, or it is echoed by what Biden said when he ran because of Trump. So what did the Kennedys have? We think of them as having celebrity, and they have youth, and they have beauty, and they have all of these things. But the one thing we generally don't talk about with the Kennedys is they had moral vision. They had moral vision. And I will make the case, and I can make the case in the 1,800 pages of this book and volume 1 taken together, that none of the Kennedys was more forcefully driven by or more forcefully embraced the notion of moral vision than the Kennedy who is largely regarded as the least moral of the family, Edward Kennedy. So, when we ask what do we learn from the Kennedys, what can we learn from Ted Kennedy, and I'm going to expand on this at some length, probably ad nauseum. And I'm a little, I'm a little disappointed we don't have more young people here because this is so damn important to understand. And I'll tell you why it's important. We think we're in a political crisis. We hear it all the time. We're not in any damn political crisis. We're in a moral crisis in America. And the single most moral politician of, I would say, the last 70 years, a man who Richard Reeves, when he died, I love this, he said, whatever you think of Edward Kennedy, he was the most politically moral, politically moral. And that is, the basis of these books. And I will just say this, Richard, because you and I talked about this as well. I didn't write these books. I didn't take 12 years of my life because I was a Kennedy idolater or because I felt, boy, you know what this country really needs, this world really needs, is it needs a definitive biography of Ted Kennedy. No, it really doesn't need a definitive biography of Ted Kennedy. And some of you know there's another biographer out there hawking his book about Ted Kennedy at the very time I'm hawking. That's not why I wrote it. That's not why I chose this. I chose the subject because I begin books not with the subject. I begin books with questions. If I'm going to devote, and it takes me a long time, or you may not know, my wife is the one who hectors me about this. It takes me a long time to write a book. Very long time, all of my books. And if I'm going to do that, what I do is I begin with questions that I want answered for myself. If I had the answer, I wouldn't write the book. I was a film critic before I got into this racket. And one of my favorite stories is a critic asked Kurosawa, I forget the film now, but asked Kurosawa, what did you mean in this film? And Kurosawa said, if I could tell you, I wouldn't have made the movie. And I kind of feel that way, in terms of the exploration of the question.
So let's jump into this. I mean, you're raising this issue of morality. One point you quote, and I forget who, the difference between the morality of politics and the politics of morality. And I think there's a nice juxtaposition there.
Well,
but let me, here's the question. Where does this come from in the Kennedy family? Why?
Well, let me talk, before I understand, Richard, I just want to complete this thought. Okay, so my question was, for this book, before I even thought of Edward Kennedy, my question was, what happened to liberals?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a liberal. I say proudly. I know it's an epithet now. To be a liberal is awful. It's terrible. It means you only believe in woke culture and your whole life is devoted to canceling people. I've been a liberal all my life.
It's okay. You're at 0213.
I understand that.
You may not be liberal enough for 0213.
I'm not liberal enough for our own children.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know, what happened? How do you take this set of beliefs, ideology, if you want to call it that, I think that's a word that dignifies it a little bit too much. What happened to it? Why did it become a dirty word, which it is pretty much now? And I thought an interesting way of exploring that. And now I get to my subject. I do this with every one of my books. Every one of my books. When I wrote Walter Winchell, I wanted to understand, how did we become a society obsessed with celebrity? Walter Winchell was, to my mind, the headwaters of this. If I understood him, we'd understand this. When I wrote An Empire of Their Own, my very first book, I wanted to understand why in the world did the quintessential American industry, Hollywood, why in the world was it founded by Eastern European Jews? That strikes me as a bizarre thing. So those were questions. Here's the question: is what happened to liberalism? And I'll just say before we get to this, Richard, I don't want to, because I want to close this thought just so you understand it as well. I spent the most of the first years on this book. I didn't touch Ted Kennedy. I didn't touch him. Didn't look at anything about him. Wasn't necessarily interested in him at that point. I read primarily about liberalism and conservatism. There's a zillion books that ask the question I'm asking. There's a zillion books that attempt to answer it. And I thought, if I find the answer, I'm not going to write the book. I'm not going to write the book if somebody says, boy, that's on the money. Now I can move on to something else. but I couldn't move on to something else. Because while there were many interesting approaches, one of the problems was that there were many. And the analysis was that liberalism died the cuts of 1,000 days. You know, there were so many little things that affected liberalism. That's not untrue, but to be perfectly honest, when you're going to spend a huge chunk of your life exploring this question, I want the samurai sword version, not the death by a million cuts version. So I thought these million cuts may be subsumed by something better. And so I spent those years. I had a Shorenstein, for which I'm very thankful. And I got to meet Richard, which was a joy, and others here. And I also got a Woodrow Wilson, and which I had before the Shorenstein. And so when I was in Washington on the Woodrow Wilson, I said, you know, I couldn't touch Kennedy right now. And I just sat there and read all this stuff. That's all I did. I holed up there. My family never comes with me on these things, so all I'm doing is just sitting there 7 days a week, as I was here. And I came up with this idea. I'm asking the wrong question. We're all asking the wrong question. Whether it's Thomas Edsel or Dion or whoever, they're all asking the wrong question. The question isn't why liberalism declined. The question is, why did it last so long when this set of beliefs and policies, which were generated largely by the New Deal, to help this country, when this country no longer felt it needed help, whether it did or it didn't. The fact of the matter was these things got so embedded into the culture that most Americans didn't think they needed it, even though they were using the New Deal and every single day. I mean, in volume 1, I quote, Dwight Eisenhower wrote a letter to his brother saying, if I dared, touch the New Deal, I'd be impeached, he said. So the answer, the question ought to be, why did it last so damn? Not why it failed, but why did it last so long when most Americans, we don't need this anymore. And most Americans, despite the whole compassion story, we're not the most compassionate people. One of the reasons healthcare had such a universal healthcare, such a damn hard problem is only 15% of the country was uncovered. If 15%, the other 85%, who gives a shit about the 15%? I remember Pat Moynihan said that himself, and I quote this in the book. Nobody cares about that 15% that Kennedy cared.
But I want to break in here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I want to get you to condense a couple of points.
Absolutely.
I wanted some shots at how this particular liberalism emerged, because it seems to me that we can't understand it without understanding the Irishness and the Catholicism of the Kennedy family and the role that the integration of an entire generation of immigrants in the 19th century represented in American politics.
Yes. Well, let me just complete the thought, because that's very important. The thought gets completed this way. Why did liberalism fail? I'll tell you why I think it failed. I'll tell you the samurai sword. It lost moral authority. Now, the project of conservatives was to destroy its moral authority. And you know what? They succeeded. And just look at America today. Liberalism has no moral authority. And when it lost its moral authority, because conservatives has no moral authority, they knew it. You read Conscience of a Conservative and you show me a moral sentence in Barry Goldwater's book. There's not one sentence in that book that addresses morality. Not one. But when liberalism lost its moral authority, conservatism erected a moralistic authority. We'll talk about that.
Okay.
But let's get to
I want to pick up on the Irish.
Because why in the world would a guy like Ted Kennedy, basically a wastrel in the eyes of most people, a privileged young man who chased women constantly, even when he was long beyond the age when he should have been chasing women, who seemed to fight for nothing in his life, that's erroneous, who seemed to live a life in which he skated on the surface, also erroneous, but seemingly so. Why would this guy, who had everything in the world that any person could possibly want, why would he give a crap about the poor, the disadvantaged, blacks, immigrants? Why would he care? And you and I had this part of this discussion. Right. That's why I want to bring it up. Right. There's no political advantage to this. Zero. We think in politics only in terms of advantage. What do you get? You appeal to the white working class and they'll all vote for you. What advantage does Ted Kennedy, living in ethnic Massachusetts, get from befriending Blacks, from befriending the poor, from befriending people who are voiceless and powerless, and as he used to call nothing? In fact, volume 1 of my book ends with Ted Kennedy being pelted by eggs, having dog poop put on the handles of his car so he can't open his car, and being chased into the T with people who literally want to murder him, literally want to murder him. And his staff barring the doors to the station so that that crowd can't get to him. Why? Because that crowd didn't want their schools to be integrated, and they felt that Ted Kennedy was the voice of integration, which he was not, but they felt he was. So, guy who has nothing to gain, zero to gain, does this.
Okay.
And the answer is complicated. There's a lot of things. One is the question you raised, or the answer you raised, which is, you don't understand the Kennedys without understanding Irish Catholicism. Right? I mean, you just don't get it. You don't get the Kennedys unless you understand an anecdote of Rose Kennedy, which I always loved. Now, here's one of the richest families in America. This is back in the 30s. They were still, because, Joseph Kennedy had the wisdom to pull all his money out of the stock market before it crashed. That's why he had all that money. He had an instinct that it was going to crash, and he pulled it all out, and he was one of the richest men in America. And John and one of his schoolmates, our college schoolmates, are driving up to Hyannis. And Rose is in the car, and she turns to the schoolmate and says, "When are you Protestants ever going to accept us Catholics?" I mean, this is for the richest family in America. There's another story that Doris Kearns Goodwin tells in her book, and I use it in volume 1 because I think it's very striking. It's because it's a story that Joseph Kennedy used to tell fairly frequently. And it's a story of no consequence whatsoever unless you're Joseph Kennedy. Listen to this story. He used to tell the story of how he's at Harvard and he's walking down the street and he sees 2 Protestant classmates in front of him. And they turn to go into an eating club. And the first thought is, I can't go in there. There's no place for me here. And he used to tell that story all the time because the Kennedys are driven in one degree by grievance. You understand the Kennedys without grievance. Joe was really driven by grievance. How driven was he? He devoted his family to revenge against the Protestants. How are we going to beat the Protestants? My sons are all going to be presidents of the United States, so screw the Protestants. It was driven by grievance, but it was also driven by, and more importantly, in my speech, particularly in terms of Ted, and I'll explain why in a moment, it was driven by a sense of empathy. I have a feeling, and this is certainly, I'm sure not original with me, when you read Richard Hofstadter about Franklin Roosevelt, you realize what makes Roosevelt great. Infantile paralysis makes Roosevelt great. Roosevelt was a nobody and a nothing until he had infantile paralysis. When he has infantile paralysis, he projects that on the nation. Politicians do this all the time. This is what politicians do. They project themselves onto the nation. And sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's horrible. Richard Nixon believed that he lived in a nation of resentment, and he milked that and turned this into a country of resentment. You can only imagine how Donald Trump projects on the country. But in the case of Roosevelt, he projects on the country his own fallibility, and he understands the disability of Americans. In the case of Ted Kennedy, he not only projects his Catholicism and the way in which Catholics were abused and humiliated and condescended to, but within that condescension, within that humiliation, Edward Kennedy has his own personal humiliation and condescension. In volume 1 of the book, I have a chapter called The Least. He's the least of the Kennedys. The Kennedys consider him the least of the Kennedys. He's the afterthought. Rose didn't expect to have another child. As it turns out, she and Joe, who never made love, happened to make love once when he was on a trip, and boom, they have this kid who nobody really wants. And the family treats him that way. He's the comic relief in the Kennedy family from day one. Everybody in the Kennedy family is beautiful. He's fat.
So let me tease out of this.
Yes.
One, the Irishness and the sense of being looked down upon is really important.
Totally.
It's not just a sense of personal grievance and revenge, although you mentioned it with father. With Ted, it's transmuted in some sense by Catholicism and his relationship with his mother, is what I gather from the book.
Not only
as
his
well.
mother. Yeah, I mean, his mother is cold and unfeeling, but she was cold and unfeeling to everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, Rose is a real piece of work.
But he takes out of Catholicism a sense of communal responsibility,
Yes.
right? And that is going to deeply inform his notion of welfare politics, of the New Deal legacy that he'll be part of.
That, and I'll tell you what, Richard, the other thing is his own fallibility.
Okay, how so?
It's the combination. He knows that he's the least. I mean, he even says in his own, in True Compass, there is the most revealing sentence in True Compass, in my estimation, is when he says, I know I'll never be as good as my brothers. What a thing to say. When you are arguably the most consequential politician, if not consequential,
legacy, yeah.
You know, who's affected more lives than anybody in the American political life, you know, in the last 50 years. He said, no, I'll never be their equal. He doesn't believe he's the equal of anybody, to be honest. It's his own fallibility combined with his Catholicism and the fallibility of Catholicism that creates empathy. And what I was going to say is, you know what makes great leaders? Fallibility makes great leaders, because they're the only ones who get it. They're the only ones who understand what it's like to be poor, what it's like to be condescended to, what it's like to be humiliated, what it's like to be marginalized. He got it. Man, did he get it. He knew exactly what it was like. He was the Kennedy that no one respected. You don't think he knew that? Man, he goes into the Senate and everybody says, here's this jerk. Here's this imbecile. All of his life, to the very end, he was always considered the moron. You know, Jack and Bobby, they were really smart, but Ted's a moron. I think you can make the argument that Ted was a really smart one. But
I want to pull out some threads here, because I'm afraid that my audience is going to get lost in the elements that are autobiographical and psychological, and that are structural and political, and that are structural and cultural ethnic.
Yes.
And you talk about a series of failures or a series of collisions in his life that limit and reshape him. And for a period that seems to run from Carter through Clinton, really hobbles him in a profound way.
Sense, yes.
And yet he was doing important legislative work in that period, even when he was hobbled. Sketch out what a couple examples of those setbacks were. I mean, the obvious one is Chappaquiddick in a personal sense, but
yes, well, in personal sense, there's a whole series of them. I mean, there's you know, Chappaquiddick is self-inflicted, and he loses his moral authority. You know, Chappaquiddick is a very significant event in American politics. And far more significant than what it did to Ted Kennedy. I mean, you know, you don't say, well, Ted Kennedy lost the presidency. You know, who knows whether you've ever been elected president? Nobody can guess that. But it's significant because Nixon, in Volume 1, Nixon and Kissinger and all of his cohort are sitting around, and what are they doing? They're talking about Ted Kennedy. You have the tapes. Oh man, this guy, what's wrong with this guy? Oh, now we got this guy. And you know that they sent private detectives down there, you know, to find out what more they could. He took a Hawaiian vacation. They sent a detective to Hawaii, and all his job was, this is the president of the United States, is just to follow him and see who he's with. But he's not with anybody. He's not doing anything. No, keep after him. You're going to find something. So the whole idea of Chappaquiddick was that you destroy your political morality by destroying your personal morality. If we can destroy Ted Kennedy's personal morality, we can conflate that with his political morality and destroy.
Well, and so then it comes in chronological terms at roughly the same time that a couple of years later, the McGovern defeat is so stunning. I mean, only Massachusetts was carried by George McGovern in 1972, and the district, but the only state in the Union. And the sense then of not just the personal moral failures associated with Chappaquiddick, but suddenly a sense that liberalism has collapsed.
Vietnam is, you know, Vietnam and race. I mean, if you want to look at two things that rob liberalism of its moral authority, Vietnam certainly does. And it's the irony of Vietnam. We're there to save democracy. And it turns out that we wind up destroying our own democracy, in a sense, and race. Because while in 64 and 65, with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, Americans, I call this the moral crease of American life. America has this moral crease. We don't have many moral creases in this country. We might have one on Tuesday. I don't know. We'll find out. But there aren't very many moral creases. Why do I call it moral crease? Because there's this little crease in America where Americans are really good for a while. And they were really good. I mean, Americans wanted the Civil Rights Act of 64. You look at the polling data. Yeah. They wanted the Voting Rights Act.
After the early civil rights collision.
That's right.
George Wallace and Little Rock.
Yeah, I mean,
it changed the country.
It's remarkable. Now, I think I make the argument, and I would make it today, that I think a lot of that has to do with the death of John Kennedy and the shock of that death and how Americans feel they have to redeem themselves. And the redemption is the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65. And Lyndon Johnson himself says this. You read Caraho's, Lyndon Johnson, says, okay, you got to use Kennedy's death. Which is a gross thing to say, but it's a true thing. You got to use Kennedy's death, and this is how you use Kennedy's death. So you have, but then race quickly disappears. It's like Black Lives Matter. You get 2 weeks in America, 2 weeks for white Americans to go, oh my goodness, geez, this is terrible. What happened? And then after 2 weeks, it's all over. After 2 weeks, it's screw that. Look, they attacked a gas station or something. That's all. It's finished. It's all over. So that happened in America. The moral crease ended, and when the moral crease ended, and who was the main perpetrator for ending it? Richard Nixon. The genius of Richard Nixon.
Southern strategy.
The Southern strategy. The whole notion. I mean, the code words of crime being a code word for blacks. I mean, he's a genius at finding resentments and knowing how to milk them. I mean, he's one of the cruelest and worst figures in American political history. So much of the awfulness of modern American political history begins with the resentments of that man who felt he was condescended to, which is why Kennedy so deeply, but didn't use it in any productive way. You can be fallible and use it in the wrong way. And he used it in the most malign and awful ways. So these were two warriors against one another, Nixon and Ted Kennedy during Nixon's presidency. Nixon, I quote in volume 1 that it seemed as if Nixon had an ambassador in Kennedy's own office because all he cared about was what Ted Kennedy was doing. He had to monitor every single thing that Ted Kennedy was doing. And you look at Nixon's policies, so much, and I make this point in the book, everything that Nixon does is, Kennedy's going to do this, I better do this. Kennedy's going to do this, I better do this. Healthcare, I don't give a crap about healthcare, but Kennedy's going to do healthcare. Why should he get the credit for it? I'll do it. Environment, I mean, every time Kennedy did something, Kennedy used to laugh about it. He used to laugh about it. He said, every time I do something, I know that Nixon's going to do it. It's like, that's pretty good.
Let me go back on a couple of points here, because I think they're large, particularly for this generation too, that is part of that distrust of institutions. And it's both distrust of institutional conservatism, but also institutional liberalism. There seems to me to have been a kind of marriage made in hell that joined the welfare liberalism of the New Deal with the Cold War liberalism of the Pentagon. And that Vietnam, in some sense, is an unfolding of the logic of Cold War liberalism and its inability to remain focused on the welfare liberal concerns that had made Roosevelt so popular, that had made liberalism so popular. And so you get to a place where the legacy is a collapse of the welfare liberalism entirely and the emergence of this neoliberalism, which is then going to haunt the 80s and arguably the 90s and perhaps even elements of the Obama administration.
Yes, no, I mean, look, when liberalism begins to lose its moral authority because of Vietnam, because of race, although in the very wrong ways, in my estimation, and I think in most decent people's estimation, when those things happen, and because of Ted Kennedy's own failings, I mean, there's a congeries of things that that cause this to happen. How do Democrats and / liberals react? They react by trying to co-opt it. They don't react by saying, let's double down on it. You get Jimmy Carter's presidency. Now, that when you're talking about neoliberalism and what Ted Kennedy was doing in that period, I mean, that's what you're talking about. And what is Jimmy Carter? I know he's now sainted, and you know, that's fine. But what does Jimmy Carter see? Jimmy Carter says the country's conservative. You know, it's not. And to Carter's credit, Carter is saying, how much of liberalism can I maintain under this assault? And Ted Kennedy is saying, in some ways to his credit, this son of a bitch is going to destroy liberalism.
But this is a 200-year-old argument in America, it seems to me. Carter represents Southern liberalism in some sense, at its best, meaning it's very concerned about race in the sense of not wanting to overturn an apple cart of segregation carelessly in their minds. And then the other is a fear/hostility toward Washington as far away government, which is somehow the wrong kind of government, because Southern liberalism prides itself on localism, which isn't true, but which is part of the narrative.
But that's one of the reasons why there wasn't an elected Southern Democrat, like Johnson.
Right.
But you know, Democrats don't elect Southerners, and they don't elect them for the reason that Ted Kennedy says you don't elect them, because they're not true believers. See, Ted Kennedy's a true believer, and the very things you're saying cuts against everything that the modern Democratic Party, the post-Roosevelt, the Roosevelt and post-Roosevelt Democratic Party believes in. I mean, Kennedy said, you're not sufficiently liberal. You don't care sufficiently about the things about which I care, but it's not me personally, right? It's the things about, if the Democratic Party as an institution doesn't function, then basically forget liberalism for a moment. Compassion doesn't function. One of my favorite lines in American politics is Mario Cuomo's line about Raul. He made the denial of compassion respectable. Think about that, because that's the signal and single achievement of Ronald Reagan. He made the denial of compassion respectable. Well, this is what Ted Kennedy is afraid of. This is what Ted Kennedy is afraid of with Jimmy Carter. This is what Ted Kennedy is afraid of with Bill Clinton. You know, I mean, with Bill Clinton, all he thinks is Bill Clinton is self-serving. Bill Clinton has no political ideology. I mean, this is what Kennedy believes. You may believe differently. I'm just saying what Kennedy says. You know, who's ever the last person in the room with Bill Clinton is the guy who gets his vote. He thinks of Stephen Breyer and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. He says, I wasn't the last person in the room with Breyer. Somebody came in after me. He goes in and makes this case for Breyer. And then somebody comes in after and says, no, you got to give Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So what does Kennedy do on the next Supreme Court?
The next round,
he makes sure he goes there that day. He stands there next to him. He says, you know, now I've got to talk to you about Stephen Breyer. He's the last person who gets, but he doesn't trust, you know, he doesn't trust Clinton. He doesn't trust that Clinton believes.
So again, I want to thread this into a longer history that speaks to the structure of America. And then I want to take it to a question of what is it about the way in which we cumulatively look at Kennedy's career that has relevance going forward to this generation for all of this, all of the young men and women that you and I have taught. And I think that's really, particularly with this pivotal election that we've just had, something seems to be shifting. So let's do this in order. So we're now in a place where we're in the middle of an enormous new wave of migration, at least as important as the 19th century immigration that brought the Jews, the Irish, the Italians, et cetera, to the United States. Have we discovered a language that fully bonds them to the Democratic Party in the way that those 19th century immigrants were, by and large, bonded to the Democratic Party? Or are we missing something that Kennedy could teach us here?
Well, I mean, what Kennedy can teach us is this, and it's been the theme of everything we're saying. What Kennedy can teach us is that politics, in order to be successful, in his estimation, and he was a pragmatist. I mean, Kennedy was no hard and fast ideologue. You and I have had the discussion about. I mean, he was sniffing the wind sometimes to say, you know what? I mean, he's not going to do a full Carter, but he embraced deregulation with the airlines and later with the trucking industry and got an airlines deregulation bill. He helped reform the federal.
For all of you who are flying today, blame Stephen Breyer and Ted Kennedy for the lousy meal service at the seating.
It's true. It's true.
Right.
I mean, he was a pragmatist in that sense, and something of a realist. And he was never an ideologue, and he would never call himself an ideologue. His liberalism came, as I said, from his feeling, from his compassion, from his fallibility, and his identification with those who he also felt were fallible. But the thing about his politics, and when you read this book, you're not going to read the book because it's too long. But if you were to read this book,
I recommend it.
But if you were to read this book, you'd see time and time and time again, he talks about a morally driven politics. Mm-hmm. He's always talking about, the fundamentals of politics. We saw this on Tuesday. Mm-hmm. We saw this on Tuesday. I remember Michael Moore, who was the one individual who kept on saying for the last 2 months, the Democrats are going to have a great night on November 8th. Don't believe any of the crap that you hear. And one of the things he finally said when he was gloating, as he had every right to gloat, was the American people, and this gets to Ted Kennedy's world, the American people aren't going to trade their democracy for 10 cents cheaper on a gallon of gas. Now, I felt they would, to be perfectly honest, but Ted Kennedy felt they would too. Ted Kennedy felt that there is a basic decency. And if you reach that decency, if you reach that compassion, then the American people will follow. They will follow. And if you let the opposition play on the resentments and the hate, which is exactly what they do. I mean, let's be honest about this. You don't want to hear this. Nobody wants to hear this, but are liberals more moral than conservatives? Yes. Yes, they are. How would you not be more moral when you deal with compassion and decency and helping the poor and helping the, how would you not, I mean, look at Ted Kennedy's roster of things. Look at the roster of the Meals on Wheels, the National Cancer Act, the Americans with Disability Act. He was the sponsor of all of these things. S-chip, which gave, health care to those children whose parents did not qualify for Medicaid, but couldn't pay. I mean, one thing after another. This book is the story of how he was opposed on every single one of those things. By whom? By whom? By the great moralists of the Republican Party who didn't want to see children get health care? Even think about this for a moment, because it makes me angry. And nobody asks this. Nobody talks about this. Think about this for a moment. You and I talked about this, Richard. Who in the world opposes giving health care to children who can't have it? Do you know how many people have been served by S-chip? I think over 10 million. Who opposes that? Well, you read the book, you'll find out the entire Republican Party virtually opposes it. He gets Orrin Hatch to do it. And you and I had this. He gets Orrin Hatch to co-sponsor it, telling you you can't do something in a Republican Congress if you're just a Democrat. And he gets Orrin Hatch. And this is in credit to Orrin Hatch. I'm not, Orrin Hatch did this, so let's not, and he did it, he got even more than Kennedy. I have that story in the book of how Kennedy was angry at him. He felt he made a compromise, and he said, I got more than you got. And when Kennedy looked at it, he said, yeah, you're right. But how did he get Orrin Hatch? Orrin Hatch is a Mormon. Kennedy wants to finance this, but Republicans don't want to finance anything. Their argument is if you help people, it costs money, so you don't help people. I mean, basically, that's what it's about. Let's be honest about this. Let's not be dishonest. If you help people, it costs money. That's true. So don't help people. So he goes to Orrin Hatch and he says, "Look, this is going to cost money, but this is how I want to do it. How about we pay for it out of a tobacco tax? Because Mormons don't smoke and they hate tobacco." And Hatch says, "Yeah, I'm fat. It's not like I don't want kids to get health care, but we don't want to pay for it. But if you do this works."
And Kennedy was Irish enough not to attempt an alcohol tax alongside the tobacco tax, despite what the Mormons might have thought. Okay, that's pragmatic. That's good pragmatic moral politics.
But again, to get to your point, Richard, what do we tell this generation?
Mm-hmm.
And what I tell this generation, and my own kids who are part of this generation, is I said, it's all about morality. You don't win on politics. politics is a loser. You win on morality. Because if people have failed their compassion, if they have no compassion, if they have no decency, if they have no concern for others, you lost it anyway. You can't win anything. Then you're living Trump land. Then you've got nothing.
So let me ask a question about the politics of this generation as it looks for moving from the uncomposed elements of different groups with different politics toward a coalition that might be as powerful as the Reagan coalition was in the 1980s, or the New Deal coalition was from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Clearly, it's going to require an incorporation of this enormous wave of new immigrants into the United States. Second, it's going to require a story about the compassionate motivation and consequences of legislation that still is being framed by the press and the talking classes in terms of racehorse journalism, racehorse competition. How do we make a demand that starts to introduce that conversation in the moral terms that you're talking about? Is it to insistently speak in those moral terms and force the journalists to cover it, or what is it that
I think journalists will not touch morality. They won't touch morality. I mean, as I told you, I can't get anything published on morality. I did a long essay that I've written for Atlantic, and I thought in the title of it was, "Are liberals more moral than conservatives?" And the answer is yes. And it's a long essay. It's like a 20-page essay on why that's the case. And we could review that here. But first of all, we've got to convert political language into moral language. Okay. And we have to do it by being insistent. Mm-hmm. And we have to do it by demanding that our public officials do the same thing. That's how Ted Kennedy talked. That's how Ted Kennedy felt. That's how Ted Kennedy contextualized things. Why? Because he felt it, certainly, but because it was pragmatically the right. I mean, if you look at his speeches in the Senate, God knows I've looked at a lot of his speeches in the Senate. I mean, every time he was having a bit of senatorial combat, mm-hmm. I'd be reading those speeches, going through the congressional record.
And these are mostly Shrum speeches, or
are
they Shrum speeches?
Some of them are, but no, Kerry Parker did a lot of. It was one of his main legislative aid. It was his legislative aid. No, they weren't, and some of it was him. Some of it he extemporized. Mm-hmm. They always said he was a creature of his staff. His staff was really a creature. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They knew what he wanted, and they did it. They didn't give him what he wanted. He fired him. But I mean, he was one of the words you always see in conjunction with him is bellow. He was always bellowing, bellowing on the floor. I use that several times, I'm sure, in the book. But he bellowed because he was passionate. And I'll tell you this, Rich, when you talk about, what do we do? Mm-hmm. Well, Ted Kennedy was successful for many, many reasons in the Senate. He's the greatest legislator of all time. Introduced over 2,000 pieces of legislation, passed over 700, and major pieces of legislation. Most politicians crow about one thing that they do in 30 years. I mean, I love Max Baucus. You remember Max Baucus. Max Baucus was the head of the Senate Finance Committee, and Obama's in power, and they want to pass Obamacare, and Max Baucus decides that he is going to be the main engine because Kennedy's disabled. He's had his brain tumor. And in Obama's book, Obama says, Max Baucus never did. He's been in the Senate for like 30 years. He's never done anything in 30 years. I mean, he says it. He writes that in the book. You can look at Promised Land, because that's true of most people. Ted Kennedy passes 700 pieces of legislation. Why? Why does he? Part of it is his understanding the mechanics of the Senate. A good deal of it is his understanding people. I mean, I have a chapter called The Chemistry of the Senate. Chemistry of the Senate is how you work people, how you understand it. Not like Lyndon Johnson. Not like Lyndon Johnson. You work people like twisting their arms, threatening them, making them feel like if they don't do this, their political career is over. That's not Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy is the anti-Lyndon Johnson. He's the guy who goes to your office when he's Ted Kennedy. He doesn't have to go to anybody's office, but he goes to your office. He's the guy, again, apropos of Orrin Hatch. Mm-hmm. The other thing he does with Orrin Hatch, besides that tobacco tax to get STIP, is one member of Kennedy's staff was a former Broadway singer. Yeah, believe it or not. He then went to law school. He was an actual Broadway singer. His name is Nick Littlefield. Kennedy would bring Littlefield with him every time he went to Orrin Hatch's office. Now, why? Orrin Hatch was a songwriter. He wrote songs, and he produced these songs. And so Kennedy would bring Littlefield to the office to sing. But when they were closing S-Chip, he had Littlefield come to the office to sing the Songbook of Orrin Hatch.
Oh, that's crazy. The Songbook of Orrin Hatch.
Yeah.
I haven't got that CD.
There is a CD. And I'll tell you why there's a CD.
Yeah.
Now, here's why there's a
Okay.
CD, Richard. This is part of the story.
Okay.
Hatch complained to Kennedy that he was having a difficult time getting his stuff recorded now.
Right.
Kennedy's nephew, Bobby Shriver, was a music agent. What did Kennedy do? He called Bobby Shriver.
Got a CD.
He got him the CD.
That's
This is how Kennedy was. But
So-
the most important thing about how Kennedy was, and this is something that Joe Biden said at the dedication of the Kennedy Institute. He was so passionate. He was so morally driven. It was so sincere that, and sincerity goes a long way. Believe it or not, politicians are almost always insincere, which is why it went such a long way with him. But Joe Biden said at the dedication of the Kennedy Institute, I've always loved this line. He says, people didn't want to feel small in front of him, even when they were small. And I will tell you that when you read people talking about Ted Kennedy, the truth of that is stunning. People didn't want to feel small in front of a man of this moral stature. They didn't want to do that because they knew he was morally sincere. It wasn't, he didn't have to do politics. He didn't need it. Aside from 1994, when he ran against Romney, he was going to win every fucking election. So that wasn't something that he needed to concern himself with.
So let's think about this. The Kennedys, I think it was Dominic Dunn said it was the greatest political theatrical family of the 20th century. And I think it's not a derisive remark.
No.
I think that's a high compliment. But it also seems that this is a dynasty.
Show business for ugly people. That's what Taylor called politics.
But this dynasty seems now to have come to an end.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you see members of the Kennedy family emerging to serve even as shadows of these
In different ways.
remarkable brothers?
In different ways. I mean,
Okay.
I see Patrick Kennedy, he's very, very interested in mental health.
Yeah.
And in his own way, and he left
But
Congress.
not at the scale.
No,
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, it will take another political figure. And the Kennedys saw Obama this way.
I was going
You
to
and I-
say,
you and I had this-
talk a little bit about how
Yeah.
Kennedy made a very important political choice to endorse
Absolutely
Obama
did.
instead of Clinton. I'm sure that Hillary to this day has not forgiven Ted
I'm
Kennedy
sure
for
she
this.
has. There was a joke of
what was
somebody
going what was going on in Kennedy's mind when he chose
What went on in Kennedy's
this
mind
young
was,
brand
I mean,
new
Carolyn was the one who drove it.
Okay.
Because Carolyn went to him and said, about her children. So this is like 3 generations now. She said, my children love this guy. And they've seen him speak.
Mhm.
And there's just something about him.
Mhm.
And I feel the same way. She wrote the famous editorial in the New York Times, and the ways in which Obama reminded her of her father. Kennedy came to believe the same thing. And Kennedy came to believe that how we began this discussion.
Yeah.
We began this discussion about the larger narrative. And politicians don't have larger narratives, as I said earlier. But Kennedy came to believe that Obama had a larger, that he meant something real to this nation. And that Ted had to pick up, in his famous speech after Bobby was shot, he said, I pick up my brother's fallen standards. People call it the fallen standards speech.
Mm-hmm.
I think Ted felt that Obama was going to pick up that fallen standard. He was the only politician who could. He probably turned out to be right, in my estimation. And so, yes. And Obama said himself, I love this. He said, when I was sitting there watching the Kennedys sort of passing me the torch, I realized, my God, look at this responsibility. I've got this responsibility now, which he did, which he did.
So it seems to me that if there's a lesson here for a new generation, it is to look at the qualified triumphs of Ted Kennedy's career. There were no unqualified triumphs that stand out as.
There's no unqualified triumphs in anyone's career.
Well, I was just going to add it, and yet we need to respect him given the volume of legislation that he created.
And the
kind of legislation. And ultimately tacking back to a kind of liberalism that was most essential to that Irish Catholic upbringing of his, but trying to adapt it for a new generation. I think it's a bogus question for me to ask you, well, who's the new Ted Kennedy? I think that's the wrong way to think about it, and that's not what you were saying. How do you see this morality being reconnected to the Democratic Party and reconnected to the American people?
Well, there's several ways.
Okay.
One thing, you and I talked about this accountability.
Yeah.
And this accountability doesn't start with the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
It starts with us. I said the one thing that the media will not touch is morality. Can't write about that. I'll tell you the other thing you can't write about. You can't write about the American people in any negative way. I don't care if it's the New York Times or whoever, Washington Post or whoever it is. You can write unfavorably about Donald Trump and call him, the worst human being since Adolf Hitler. You can write unfavorably about the Republican Party and all those Republican apparatchiks. You can write, but you cannot write unfavorably about the American people. Now, Donald Trump did not arise full sprung out of Richard Nixon's head. So, what you've got to understand is he was facilitated, you don't understand this, you know it, by the American people, by the Republican Party. And anyone who votes Republican, knowing what they know about Republican morality, anyone who votes Republican is accountable. Forget Donald Trump. If you vote Republican, you're accountable. And I'm going to switch that around. Because we saw this on Tuesday. One of the reasons the Democrats did so well is young people came out and voted. You saw that probably. It's a very big reason. Mm-hmm. So young people came out. If there's any young people watching this, they haven't gone to sleep by now. Mm-hmm. You are also accountable. You're accountable for the positivity of your vote. Mm-hmm. You're accountable for doing good things. You're accountable for bringing morality back into politics. I mean, maybe someday, some night on a steed will come to us the way that the Kennedys seem to do, but I doubt that. I mean, there might be another figure like Obama, but usually what happens is we make them. They don't make us. We made Roosevelt. Roosevelt didn't make us. We made Kennedy. And we'll make somebody else, but we can only make somebody else if we are morally driven. And if young people are not morally driven, who will? I look at my own children. And, I have one daughter who's a social worker and another daughter who's a pediatrician. And they've said to me both the same sorts of things when I talk politics with them. They say, Dad, we live our politics. Mm-hmm. They are both my social worker daughter deals with at-risk children. My pediatrician daughter obviously she's an emergency pediatrician at Boston Children's Hospital. She deals with at-risk children. They live their politics. This generation can save us. And if they don't, we're lost. Democracy is not won because Democrats did well on Tuesday. Democracy hangs by a thread. We've got an entire political party that's dedicated to destroying it. And the figure who leads that party is dedicated to destroying it. And so, take a page from Ted Kennedy's book. Be morally driven. Don't think politically. Think morally first. What's the right thing to do? How do you help people? What do you do for people? How can the political system help people? Those are the questions. Be accountable. Be accountable for your vote. Be accountable for your life. Make sure your life matters. Make sure your life matters. I try to inculcate that in my children all the time. Make your life matter. And then you'll save this damn country, if it can be saved.
Neal, I want to thank you very much. We have been talking with Neal Gabler, the author of Against the Wind, And this is the second of 2 volumes, biography of Edward M. Kennedy. And I think to say that it's the biography of Kennedy is not to say enough about it. It's a biography of America in a certain period of American existence.
Thank you.
And it attempts to anchor our collective experience in the experience and the lived activity of an extraordinary senator and an extraordinary political family. So Neal, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Any questions for those? Yes, I have one here and I have one here.
I really appreciate that you are framing this. It's in a sense of morality, because one of the things that is most outrageous to me related to Trump and the Republican people's support of Trump is the religious right. How and why? I just saw an amazing documentary, God forbid, about Jerry Falwell Jr. and his incredibly immoral situation with the third party in his marriage, and how that really tilted towards Trump because Trump had the goods on him. And I mean, very, very interesting. But I mean, can you speak to that? I mean, certainly the Christians, I say it in quotes, think they're being moral. They think they are moral by, you know, what they do, and yet they supported this incredibly immoral man.
Well, that's a very complicated question, obviously. So let's take it apart a little bit. One thing, when the Christian right entered politics, and remember, you know, Carter preceded Reagan, and Carter really brought religion into politics, and the evangelicals voted overwhelmingly for Jimmy Carter in 1976. Overwhelmingly. What happened was that the evangelicals, because of Carter going after, I mean, these things turn on such idiotic things, such small things. Carter wanted to deny the evangelical segregated schools tax exempt status. And so they were furious. This is in the book. You'll see the meeting that Carter has with Jerry Falwell, the original Jerry Falwell.
The dad.
And you know, the dad. And he has a meeting with Falwell and the other, you know, and he's Carter, who always thought he was a little bit like the smartest guy in the room. You know, wasn't always the smartest guy in the room. Certainly politically speaking, he wasn't. You know, thought that, you know, these guys were going to come around to him because he was one of them or whatever. And they were saying, no, we're basically not coming around to you, because they were furious about this tax exempt status. Remember, the whole idea of, this isn't in the book, but you probably know this. I mean, the whole idea of the rise of the political evangelicals was Brown versus the Board of Education. Them starting segregated schools so they wouldn't have to have their children educated with blacks. That was, now what happens, I mean, that's sort of dormant. They get their wish, they're in the South after. But what happens is they find an ally who is using them to build a coalition. And this is why, you know, they don't even pretend to, I mean, they have a slight pretense of being moral. They call themselves the moral majority, but we know what their morality is. The idea is that Falwell and his cohort realized that they can use Reagan, who has no interest in religion whatsoever. I mean, one of the lines I quote in the book is Colson asking him whether he was born again. And Reagan, he says, Reagan looked at me as if I was from Mars. He said, what does that even mean, basically? I don't know. Reagan has no interest in religion, zero interest in religion.
And Nancy's was in astrology.
It was, yes. So, but Reagan realizes that, you know, this coalition can be built. The evangelicals are ready, willing, and able to support it. They need an agent, a political agent. And Reagan is their political agent. This is completely politically based. There's no, you know, even abortion. It's a very interesting thing about abortion. Abortion doesn't enter American politics until very late. I understand somebody criticized the first volume of my book because I didn't talk about abortion. Well, the person didn't, I mean, I don't read reviews, but the person doesn't know what he's talking about, because abortion really doesn't enter American politics until this volume. And even I have a footnote that I just read this morning about what role did abortion play in the 1980 election. And when you do the math on it, it plays a very small role. Abortion becomes a tool by the right. You know, the right is always looking for this stuff that they can use. And abortion becomes a way, a tool to pry Catholics away from the Democratic Party. But it's not like the country. Abortion isn't an issue. People don't care about abortion until relatively late. Now, you know, abortion is gigantic. But this is relatively new in American politics. It wasn't like everybody's going around screaming about abortion back in 1980 when Reagan was elected. It wasn't. It wasn't. So my point again is that the evangelicals are never religious. Evangelicals were political. They're a political movement interested in political power. When they're more candid, they say so. Because, you know, what's the morality? Where's the morality in hurting people? I don't know. I mean, let's be basic about it. I know I sometimes I just want to cut to the chase. The cut to the chase is, where is the morality in hurting people? In hurting people who can't defend themselves. I don't understand it. I don't understand it.
Let me take one more question over here. You have a question?
Well, my question is, if you haven't read either book, as I have not, do you start at the first or start with the second one? You've written them both.
I would start with, I mean, I wrote them through as a single book. I mean, I just wrote them. You know, I didn't take a pause and, you know, I just wrote them. And then I didn't look at how long they were. I didn't care. I don't write that way. I'm not, you know, to be honest, you know, I write the books for myself. You know, because if you write for other people, you find yourself doing things you don't want to do and whatever. So I just write. I always, and I tell my students this: write a book you buy. You know, this book costs, I think, $45 or something. It's a lot of money. So write a book you buy. If you're not writing a book you buy, then you're writing the wrong book. But I think to get the full contour, Richard is absolutely right. And, you know, I don't want to be, it may sound self-aggrandizing, and if it is, believe me, I have every reason to be humble, and I am. But these books I intended to be a story of American politics for the last, you know, well, the last 50 years of Ted Kennedy's life. That's what they're intended.
And they're
it's not
just
just
to the next 50 years. That's
exactly.
They arrive at a moment where American politics is turning once again. So the timing of their appearance is really quite important. So
yes, I didn't intend it to be 2 volumes. I didn't intend it to be just a book about Ted Kennedy, obviously. I mean, you'll get a ton about Reagan, a ton about Lyndon Johnson, a ton about Richard Nixon. They're all in here. It's a cast of, you know, it's a big book for a reason, I think. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, it's big because the subject is very, very big. And Ted Kennedy lived through it, and he's the spine through it.
I am going to wrap this up. We're running just a couple minutes late. Neal, again, I want to thank you.
Thank you, Richard, so much. Thank you. I'm especially heartened to see these young folk.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.